And then we're going to look at, really, as the question says at the top of your lesson, we're on lesson number 2, was Jesus an effective teacher? But we use titles in all kind of situations to denote a relationship more than anything else. As I've got there in your book, if I get a phone call and the first response I hear on the other end of the line is, "Hey, Dad," I know it's Michael, Ryan, or Craig, one of my 3 sons. That's going to be that. If I meet somebody for the first time, Melissa and I introduce Melissa as my wife, a title that she would have, or that I'm her husband. We use titles all the time and names all the time. There's over 40 different names that are ascribed to Jesus in the Bible. I've got a few of them there. Lord, Son of God, Emmanuel, Master, Son of Man. You may be able to think of some others as well. But it may be surprising for you to know, it certainly was for me when I first started studying this years ago, that the title teacher is the 4th most used title for Jesus. Would not have expected that. I didn't think that. I don't know where I would have put it if I had even thought that to be the case. So what do you think is the number 1 name or title to refer to the Lord? It's not in your book. You don't, looking down isn't going to help you any. Huh? No. No. Jesus. Okay. Just want you to know that's the most common of all. I said title or name, Jim. I'm going to make you leave the class if you keep this up, okay? All right, the number 2. What do you think is the number 2? Now we could go to Edwin. No, that's wrong, but I just want to go to you. What else? Huh? No, not Son of Man. No. Oh, well, now, maybe according to King James, because King James mistranslates several words, which we'll talk about on that. So, yes, it uses the term master a lot. It obscures the meaning. What else? Nope. I said that's number 4. So we're looking at number 2. Jesus Christ is not the answer. It's number 2 is what? No. That's what I said. No. Lord. There we go. I don't know who said that, but yes, that's exactly right. Number 3. What is the third one? We're just keep on guessing, I guess. Son of Man, okay? So that was a favorite term Jesus actually used of himself. Son of Man, I think, to show his connection to mankind. So that's correct. Yeah, that was his favorite term of himself, yes. So we're going to take a look at the word teach or teacher tonight specifically, since that's the focus of our class on teaching as Jesus taught. And so there are some different Greek words that are used to refer to him as teacher. Didaskalos is used 46 times. It's actually used more than that, but it's 46 times referring to Jesus. The word didaskalos, I really wanted to impress you, so I put it in Greek there next to it, okay? And it literally means to teach or instruct. It's one who regularly engaged in systematic imparting of knowledge or technical skills, such as an elementary teacher, a tutor, a philosopher, even a choir master or chorus master was referred to as a didaskalos. It is suggested by the root of the word is dek, D-E-K, which literally means to extend the hand. I think this is a beautiful point I want you to get out of the word didaskalos, or teacher. It comes from the root word dek, D-E-K, which means to extend the hand. And some suggest, because of the repetition of didask, that it means to extend the hand over and over and over again. And that's what a teacher does. A teacher extends the hand or extends information and does this on a repeated basis. And this is the idea of Jesus. It's repeatedly offering knowledge, a concept, or a skill for them to accept. And so he is a didaskalos. The King James, as was mentioned, it obscures the word of master. And if you look and you read through the Old King James Version, it will translate several, at least 3 of the 5 words we're going to look at. I think maybe even all 5 at one time or another with the term master, the English word. It's a misuse, really, in the sense of today. But it was translated master because it was the Old English term for the Latin magister, which was a schoolmaster. And that's why they used the word back there when they translated it at the time. So as I've got here, this term is used by his enemies of Jesus, the Pharisees. They asked the question, Matthew chapter 9 and verse 11, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? The tax collectors use this term in Matthew 17:24. Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? The Sadducees used it in Matthew 22 and verse 24. Teacher, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7? So why would you think that these people, these enemies, would call Jesus teacher? Were they honoring him as their teacher? Okay, I'm getting some head shakes. I'm sorry, what? Okay, I guess there could be that, but I mean, a teacher was pretty well regarded in that community in that time. So why do you think that they would call him teacher? What? To mock him? Well, but like I said, that was a term actually that was used in reverence of people. Rabbis use that term, and of themselves. Okay, yeah, I don't think that they thought of him as their teacher, that's for sure. They weren't going to honor him in that regard. So why would they call him teacher? Yeah, Richard. Exactly, because that's what he did. Yeah, I mean, they were just recognizing his place in the community. He was a recognizable teacher. Whether they agreed with him or not didn't make any difference. They were just recognizing him. I mean, you could have a plumber, and he's not a good plumber, but he's still a plumber. And so that's the idea of what they're doing here. His followers use this term as well. The disciples said, teacher, don't you care that we drown, in Mark chapter 4, verse 38? James and John said, teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you, in Mark 10 and verse 35. Martha said in John chapter 11 and verse 28, the teacher is here asking for you, says to her sister. Interested parties who came up to Jesus on occasion, they used the term. An expert of the law said, teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? In Luke chapter 10 and verse 25. Jairus' servants said, your daughter is dead. Why do you bother the teacher anymore? In Mark chapter 5 and verse 35, and then in Luke chapter 12 and verse 13, someone in the crowd said, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. So they used the term teacher respectfully when they came up to Jesus and recognizing him. Jesus himself used this term of himself. He said, go into the city to a certain man and tell him that the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house, in Matthew 26 and verse 18. In John 13:13, Jesus said to them, you call me teacher and Lord. And then he said, and rightly so, for that is what I am. So Jesus is a teacher. And he is a didaskalos. He was one who would instruct or impart knowledge by extending the hand over and over and over again. He would try to impart knowledge and spread that. So besides the title of teacher that Jesus is specifically referred to, the verb form, that's the noun, the verb form of this same word, didaskalos, the verb form of that is found repeatedly in the Gospels of Jesus. And how do you think that would be translated? If we're moving from a noun to a verb. Taught or teach, yeah, that he taught them, and we read that numbers of times. So Jesus not only is called a teacher, when Jesus did what he did, they said he taught them, or he was teaching them, a different form of the same word. He instructed crowds, and there's another word that talks about when he would give a parable, that he told them a parable, and it's still the idea of instructing by presenting this. So where did Jesus teach? if he's the teacher? Where did he teach? What? He taught all over the place. Okay, he taught on the open streets. He taught at the temple. He taught at the synagogue. He taught in people's homes, as we looked at last week. Lots and lots of places. So, do people view you as a teacher? That's your question. That was actually in the book. Do they view you as a teacher? Steve, do people view you as a teacher? Steve Hill? Okay, so why do they view you as a teacher? Okay. Okay. But they do it because they see you doing something in particular, right? Imparting knowledge or trying to lead or guide students in a certain direction or whatever the case is. So you can be recognized as a teacher by doing what? Teaching. Yeah, I mean, that's the point of it. I realize this is pretty simple, but it's important for us to understand that Jesus is a teacher. And he was recognized as a teacher by enemies, by interested parties, by his own disciples, and even called himself teacher. So he is a didaskalos. He is one who would impart knowledge. The second word here is rabbi. It's the English word rabbi is used 14 times and it refers to Jesus. The word literally means my great one and is a term of respect primarily addressed to a teacher. It is a transliteration of the Hebrew and Aramaic word, and as such doesn't appear at all in the book of Luke. Why would you think that would make sense? It doesn't appear at all in the book of Luke. Who was Luke writing to? Who did Luke write his gospel for? Largely a Gentile or Greek audience. And so why would you use a Hebrew term? You're writing to people who wouldn't understand it. So Luke doesn't use the word rabbi. He's writing to a non-Jewish audience. Jesus' opponents, here's an interesting point too. His enemies and opponents, how often do you think they called him rabbi? Never, because it means my great one. The enemies were not going to come up to Jesus and revere him in that regard. So they never use it. They use the term didaskalos most often. As a title suggests, rabbis, my great one, were highly revered and highly regarded. In fact, according to some historical information, they were told to revere and to honor a rabbi above their own parents. So if your father and the rabbi are walking along carrying a burden and they are tired, your responsibility was to relieve the rabbi first before you would relieve your father of the burden, if there was that situation. And that's a lot of different situations along this. The disciples called him Rabbi, John chapter 4 and verse 31. Rabbi, they said, eat something. Judas, who would later betray him, said at Matthew chapter 26 and verse 25 at the supper, Rabbi, surely it's not I. My great one. Surely you're not talking about me going to betray you. Nicodemus, who was interested, said in John chapter 3 and verse 2, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher, that is a didaskalos, that you have come from God, but you're a great one in his eyes. The crowd even said, Rabbi, when did you get here? When Jesus had walked across the water and made it to the other side. So Jesus was similar to rabbis of their day in that he had a small band of disciples whom he taught. Jesus also had people come to him and ask him questions because they revered him in some way. In fact, that would be something that rabbis would often face. People would even come to rabbis for a legal matter that they want settled. Did that ever happen to Jesus? We already read it once already tonight of teacher, tell my brother to settle the account this way as far as the inheritance was concerned. That they wanted some intervention here. So Jesus did that. He taught people that came to him with questions, that disputed with him. Jesus also, like the rabbis, quoted the law. Jesus also honored the Old Testament. Jesus also sat most often when he taught, and the disciples would either sit lower or stand around him while he taught. So in those ways, Jesus was similar to the rabbis of the day. But in what way would you say that Jesus is different from rabbis of his day? Can you think of some things maybe that he said about the rabbis? He was, okay, that's exactly right. He didn't try to attract attention to him in that regard of being very showy. The rabbis often were. What else can you think of? Okay, in what way? Okay. And at the end, Matthew 7 and verse 28, he taught them as one having authority. The Pharisee, excuse me, the rabbis of the day, when they taught, they would, for their authority, quote other rabbis. And Rabbi Ben Hillel says, thus and so. And so that would be verification that what they're teaching is true. In fact, there was a rabbi who said, I've never taught anything that I've not learned from another man. Okay, so that's dangerous ground to be on. Jesus never said anything like that. Jesus never did anything like that. In what other way can you think of? Richard? Okay, exactly. The rabbis of the day hung around the religious elite. They liked to be around the scribes. They liked to be around. Jesus just seemed to actually be put off by them, and Jesus hangs around women and prostitutes and sinners and publicans and just anybody and everybody. He was out among the rabble of the crowd or the rabble of the day. What other ways can you think of? Rabbis back then were served by their students or pupils. Was Jesus served by them? What did Jesus say? I didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as ransom for many. Where did the rabbis of the day, where did they like to go when they were in public? They like to stand on the street corner and gather the attention, like what Steve said before, but also when they would go to a feast of some kind, where did they want? They wanted the chief seat, okay, the best place. They wanted to be recognized. Jesus didn't do that, and so on. So he was not like that. In fact, one of the other things, maybe the strongest thing that was different, is that if you were a pupil in a rabbi's school, your intention and your hope was, at the end of whatever period of time this was, you would become what? A rabbi, exactly. You would then become a teacher, a rabbi, a great one yourself, and amass your own following behind you or underneath you. But Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 8 that the disciple should never be called rabbi and shouldn't be a rabbi because he was the only one. And so there was a distinction there. Okay, so we could talk a lot more about it. The next word that is referred to Jesus 7 times is epistates. And it's this one is a superintendent or a leader or a master. Again, the title is never used by the opponents or the enemies of Jesus. It's found 6 times on the lips of his closest followers and once from the 10 lepers that were seeking healing from him. Every time the word is used, it accompanies a need or an appeal of some kind, and it appears only in the book of Luke. In Luke chapter 8 and verse 24, the disciples in the boat said, Master, Master is how it's translated in some. We are going to drown. It could be teacher as well, or superintendent. Peter used it, Master. The people are crowding and pressing against you, Luke 9:33. The 10 lepers, Jesus, Master, have pity on us, they said in Luke 17 and verse 13. So why do you think none of Jesus' opponents, whether the Pharisees, Sadducees, or whoever, any of those other, why do you think none of them ever used this title for Jesus or rabbi for Jesus? Yeah, they didn't want to revere him, give him honor or respect in that way, so that they just refused to use this word or these words of him. All right, the next word is Rabboni. We usually pronounce it Rabboni in the English. It's used 2 times referring to Jesus. It's the highest form or the heightened form of Rabbi. and it means my very great one, my very highly exalted one. Blind Bartimaeus said in Mark chapter 10 and verse 51, Rabboni, that I might receive my sight. When he said, what do you want? Well, I want to get my sight. He called him my very great one. Mary Magdalene, Jesus said unto her, Mary, she turned. Now, this is after his burial, now at his resurrection. She sees Jesus for the first time, and she says, Rabboni, my very great one. And remember, she clings on to him. She's just so impressed with seeing Jesus at this time. It says, which is teacher, is how it's translated. So, Rabboni, my very great one. I was reading a book one time and looked to see who the author was, and it said underneath his name, the title was The Very Right Reverend, whatever his name, whatever. The Very Right Reverend. I mean, that was the English equivalent, realistically, of Rabboni, is what they were saying of him. And then this last word, kathegetes, is it's used one time referring to Jesus. The word appears only twice in the same verse, spoken by Jesus. He says in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 10, nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, that is Christ. And this word literally means to lead or to be a guide. And what Jesus is, in essence, is saying in that passage is, I'm the only real leader, I'm the only real guide that there is for you to follow. So, those words, all referring to Jesus, all referring to him as a teacher, all could be translated by the word teacher. So why look at it like this? Why look at these titles? I mean, why should we do this? What's the reasoning? It does tell us something about him, okay? What else does it tell us? All right, how people viewed him who actually heard him do what he was doing. They looked at him and they said, you're a teacher, or you are a great one, a revered teacher, or you are a very great one, or you are our leader, you're a guide, or Jesus uses this of himself. You're a superintendent, or one who has mastery over these things. So they saw him in that light. And so we should see Jesus in this light. And typically, as I've mentioned last week, we don't think of this role of Jesus as being that high. We tend to think of him as a preacher, and we tend to think of him as a deliverer, and maybe we think of him as maybe a healer, but we don't think of him just teaching. But that was the fourth most common term that they used of him as teacher. So before we go any further, we need to address then this most fundamental question. That's why it's the second lesson in the class. Was Jesus an effective teacher? That's the title of this lesson. What did the people who heard him think about his teaching? How do we normally measure an effective teacher? If you were in high school or you were in college, you went to some business class and you had a teacher, how would you measure them as being effective? What would be the criteria you would use? What's that? Okay, now a real answer. Okay, what's that? Okay, their performance. Okay, in what way? What do you mean? Okay, all right, so, but how do we measure that? I mean, I can say performance and whatever, but yeah, Mary Grace? Okay, so if I'm benefited from this, okay, I learned some new things that I didn't know before, or I learned how to do something, or better way to do something, or whatever the case is, some skill or some knowledge that's going to help me. What else do we use? Okay, all right, so we, how do we measure it on what kind of response people give to that? And we think, and I say, Andrew, you took that class, was that any good? And you say to me, oh man, that was great, I really enjoyed it, so I want to go take this class. Or now you even say, next time he teaches something, what? I'm going to sign up for that class because I really think this or that. Randy? Okay, all right. So that you actually can prove that what he said is accurate and does work and so on. All right, and we tend to look at it and measure it. I mean, in just a very fundamental way of, was I interested by what he said? I mean, if I'm sitting there bored to tears the whole time, then I don't view him as a good teacher. Okay, I don't care if I get a passing grade. I look at this and say, all right, I could name some classes that I was in college and just thought, this is just an absolute waste of time. And just make it through to the semester, get my grade, and I won't take this guy again, okay? Or I won't take this kind of class or whatever. And most all of us have done that in high school, college, or whatever the case is. So what did the people think who heard Jesus teach? Is he the kind of teacher that we should even strive to emulate? Is what I'm asking. So let me go through a few things here. Many who heard Jesus teach in John chapter 6 and verse 60 said, this is a hard saying, who can understand it? Okay, so when Jesus taught and they listened, what did they say? Yeah, and I think really in the context, it was even more than that. It was more like, I don't like it and I'm not going to do it. But you're right, that their answer was, he said some really hard things and I don't understand this. So after Jesus then went on and further explained in this same setting, John chapter 6 verses later said, many of the disciples, now what's a disciple? A follower of Jesus, okay, or a follower. Many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. So they listened to Jesus, and what did they do? What did they decide to do about his teaching? They chose to reject it and walk away from it, okay? Here's another situation. One of his closest companions, one of his own hand-picked disciples, was the means whereby they gained the upper hand on Jesus and had him arrested. So was Judas paid a king's ransom to betray Jesus? No, he was paid 30 pieces of silver. You know what that was? The price of a wounded slave, if you were to go buy one. A wounded slave cost you 30 pieces of silver. So he wasn't paid a king's ransom. He did what with the teaching of Jesus? He rejected, turned away from it. He chose not to be persuaded by the teaching of Jesus. Okay? Third situation. The other 11 hand-picked, chosen disciples of Jesus all ran for cover when the authorities arrested Jesus in Gethsemane's garden. After the desertion in the garden, Peter was given a front row seat at the proceedings as they began to unfold. And what did he do? He denied Jesus once, twice, 3 times over the course of a month, over the course of one evening. And so what did Peter do at that time with teaching of Jesus? Chose just to walk away from it, set it aside. The religious establishment of the day, they doggedly stood opposed to everything that Jesus taught. They repeatedly confronted Jesus. They repeatedly challenged Jesus. And now that Jesus was in the hands of the political authorities of the day, did the religious hierarchy that was then, did they rethink and simmer down? No, what did they do? Yeah, the political leader said, I don't find anything worthy of crucifying him. I'm just going to beat him and let him go. And what did the religious leaders do? You remember? It said they stirred up the crowd to chant, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. So the religious leaders of the day, even though he was pronounced not guilty, would not let Jesus go free. Matthew chapter 27 and verse 27, the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a good guy, right? No, he was a murderer and an insurrectionist. He was a troublemaker from the word go. And they said, we'd rather have him than we would Jesus. So you release to us Barabbas and crucify Jesus. So here's the question. So he was rejected by most of the people who heard him. He was betrayed by one of his handpicked companions. He was forsaken by the other 11 companions. He was denied by the vocal leader of the group, Peter. He was persecuted by the religious leaders of the day and was ultimately crucified. Is it even right for us to consider Jesus as an effective teacher? Okay, so how come? Okay, so then this next question, if he is the greatest teacher the world has ever known, how do we explain these, quote, deficiencies then in his teaching? How can we explain that the crowds who came to Jesus and listened to him teach eventually walked away and rejected him? How do we explain that? If he is the greatest teacher to ever live, meaning they can't change? Okay. William? Okay. 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 All right. Richard? Okay. Yeah, we talked last week that Jesus never had the reaction when he was teaching that people just yawned and they were nonplussed by what he said. Jesus always had reaction to his teaching. Some of them accepted it, some of them got angry, some of them said, well, forget this, and they walked away. I mean, there was always reaction to his teaching. And he was effective in the sense that the material was there, and in fact, we know that they understood most often what he was asking them to do, but they chose, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that, Jim. That's right. I mean, it was even as Jesus taught. All right, Mary Grace, you had your hand up a minute ago. Okay, yeah, the effectiveness is easily seen as we look at it historically. We look at it now and we see it has changed the world. The entire world is different, as Edwin said. It's a changed world because of what Jesus has done. But at that time, if you looked at him and if you were one just writing history of the day, here is Jesus. Is he the master teacher of the first century if you're just a viewer watching and listening and seeing him? I mean, you're going to evaluate these different things and say, I don't think so. There were others who had bigger followings, or others he was amazing. Wow, he did some things that really startled people. But what did they do to Jesus? They killed him. They said, we don't want your teaching. We don't want you as our leader. So the crowds coming to Jesus but eventually leaving him doesn't say that he's not an effective teacher. It says what you guys have been pointing out, that I don't want to accept what he has to say. I'm not going to do what he tells me to do. I'm not going to change my life to live by his standard. Absolutely. Yeah. I've had people come to me through the years. I've been preaching 40 years. So I've had people come to me and say, I don't know how everybody that wasn't a Christian didn't come forward after hearing a sermon like that. No, I don't mean just me, but I'm just saying a sermon that pointed out this is what you need to do or you're going to end up in hell. And people come up to me and I've had this through the years numbers of times say, I don't know how people sat there and didn't do it. And the answer is really, really simple. They didn't want to. I mean, that's all that it is. They didn't want to change their life. They did not want to do what God said to do. So it's not a matter of, so what do we do? Do we just give up on that person? No, you continue to extend the hand. You continue to try to teach that person and proclaim the message, because things happen in different ways. So how about the religious leaders of the day rejecting him? I mean, these were the religious leaders. Why did they reject Jesus if he's the greatest teacher ever? Hillary? Okay, yeah. Okay, there were certainly, there was a sizable portion. Right. Yeah, and the passage in John 6 where I read before that they listened and finally they said, this is a hard saying, who can take it, and they walked away. What was the context? You remember what he was talking about there in John 6? Huh? No. Yeah, you got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And they said, huh? Wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Now, Jesus wasn't talking about the Lord's Supper. Don't misunderstand that and tie that to the Lord's Supper in John chapter 6. He was talking about assimilating him into their life. You've got to take me into your life. And it's just like we have to eat the flesh and drink the blood of Jesus to bring him in and take him into our life. And they said, I don't know about that. And they just turned around and walked away. They weren't going to listen to it. How about Judas? I mean, his own hand-picked disciple. I mean, he got to see, he had a front row seat on all of this and on the miracles that Jesus did. Is he the most effective teacher? Judas walked away from him. Why? Well, he did. Okay. What'd you say? Greed. Okay. Yeah, that's what we're told, that he stole from the money bag. He was the treasurer of the group, and he stole from that. And so here he got offered 30 pieces of silver. Okay, hey, that's going to be a quick buck. And I can do this quite easily. Just tell you where he is, and I'll point out who he is. I'll give him a kiss of greeting. And he does. The 11 who flee at the time of his arrest. How? How, if he's such a great teacher? The frailty of humans. What else? Okay. They were afraid. Okay. I mean, that's the simple explanation. They were afraid. They saw Jesus arrested and led off. And what is the next thought in your mind? I'm his follower. I'm next. Exactly. They're going to take me off. And so I don't know this guy, and I mean, I'm going to run away from him, and because I'm fearful of my own life. The political leaders of the day then will ultimately have him crucified. So in contrast, in this last question that you've got, in contrast, what is the common denominator in the following references that I gave you that Jesus taught both friends and foe alike? What was the common denominator if you read those verses? If a frog had wings, he wouldn't bump his rear. Okay, so you didn't read the verses, right? Is that what I'm getting from this? Huh? The common denominator is you did not read the verses ahead of time. Okay, I see. So let's read a couple of them. Okay, turn to Luke chapter 4 and verse 22. I didn't print these out in my but somebody turn and read that for me. First one gets there. Luke 4:22. Read that. Okay, I could have gotten there by now. Okay. All right, so everybody listened to him, and what was their reaction? They were amazed. Okay, drop down to verse 36. Read that, Luke 4:36. Okay, so they were amazed again, okay? Matthew chapter 7 and verse 28, the last verse of the Sermon on the Mount. The people listened to him, and what was their reaction? They were amazed or astonished because he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes of the day. That's the common denominator in all these. He amazed or he astonished people with his teaching and with his authority and his power. So, what did Jesus do or say that left them so amazed? I mean, he taught them with authority, but he taught them with power as well. Well, let's just wrap it up this way. So let's go back to the question before. Is he the greatest teacher that's ever been known? Yes. Is he an effective teacher? Yes. He's changed the entire world in which we live. 2,000 years later, here we are today in Ocala, Florida, thousands of miles from where Jesus walked, and we're talking about the very things that Jesus said and the very things that Jesus did. He is the world's most effective teacher that has ever been, which only makes sense because he is God in fleshly form. And so we have God among us, among man, teaching. It's going to be the best. It's going to be the most effective. All right, so next week we're going to start a two-part lesson really on some of the characteristics of Jesus as him being an effective teacher. And I would ask you to read and look through the lesson before you come in. There's just, 2, 3, 4 questions. There's not many questions in each of these lessons. And give it some thought, and then we'll come together, and next week we will get into that. Anything else before we close up tonight? Thanks for being here. Please be safe on your way home. Appreciate getting to stand before you this evening. If you did not get a book and you'd like one, raise your hand, and I'll get you one right now. Okay, you may pass out now if you haven't already.